Hello, listener. If you're hearing this, you probably live within sight of other people, within walking distance of help, within shouting distance of another human voice. If you're new here, subscribe and comment where you're listening from. This story is about what happens when all of that is taken away. About spending 200 days on a rock in the ocean where the only company is the sound of waves and your own deteriorating mind. About maintaining a light that guides ships that will never come. About learning that humans aren't meant to be alone, and what happens when we are anyway. My name is Thomas Brennan, and before the world caught fire and died screaming, I was a lighthouse keeper. Specifically, I maintained Graves Light Station, a 150-foot tall lighthouse built on a tiny rocky island called the Graves, located 3 miles off the coast of Massachusetts in Boston Harbor's outer approaches. Most lighthouses are automated now, have been for decades, but a few historic stations still maintain resident keepers, partly for preservation, partly for tourism. Partly because some places need human presence. Graves Light was one of them. It was my job to live on this isolated rock, maintain the light and fog signal, keep the structure in good repair, and serve as a weather observer for the National Weather Service. I'd been the keeper for 6 years when the outbreak started. Some people couldn't handle the isolation, the loneliness, the constant sound of wind and waves, the feeling of being cut off from the world. But I loved it, loved the simplicity, loved having one job. Keep the light burning, loved the rhythm of lighthouse life, maintain equipment, check weather, tend the light, watch the ocean, repeat. The island itself was barely an island, just a rocky outcrop maybe 200 feet in diameter, nothing but granite and barnacles, completely underwater during high tide storms. The lighthouse stood at the center of a massive granite tower that rose 150 feet above the water, topped with the light chamber and its powerful beacon. Inside the tower was my world. Living quarters on the first 3 levels, bedroom, kitchen, storage, equipment rooms in the middle levels, generators, pumps, radio equipment, the light chamber at the top, reached by climbing 142 spiral stairs, where the massive Fresnel lens rotated constantly, sending its beam across 30 miles of ocean. I had supplies delivered every 6 weeks by Coast Guard boat, had a radio for emergency contact, had solar panels and backup generators for power, had rainwater collection and a small desalination unit for drinking water. Everything I needed to survive on this rock indefinitely. Everything except other people. The outbreak reached Boston on April 15, 2024. I was in my quarters on the 3rd level, listening to the radio, when the first reports came through. Mass casualty event in downtown Boston. Authorities requesting people stay indoors, avoid contact with aggressive individuals exhibiting unusual behavior. I went up to the light chamber, used the high-powered telescope we kept for ship observation, pointed it at the mainland 3 miles away. Even from 3 miles out, I could see the smoke, multiple fires in the city. I could see movement on the streets, crowds of people, but moving wrong, chaotic. I could see flashing emergency lights everywhere. Over the next 6 hours, I watched Boston fall. The radio reports became more frantic. Infected individuals are attacking people on sight. If bitten, seek medical attention immediately. Military deploying 2 major population centers. Then, avoid all contact with infected. The infection spreads through bites. Victims turn within hours. Evacuate cities if possible. Then this is an emergency broadcast. The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States government. Remain indoors. Do not approach infected individuals. Military assistance is en route. Then nothing. Just static. The emergency broadcasts looped for maybe 12 hours, then stopped. The radio went silent except for occasional fragments of desperate survivors calling for help on open channels. I watched through the telescope as the city burned, watched as the streets filled with infected, watched as boats fled the harbor, some making it to open ocean, others being overwhelmed before they could escape the docks. I was 3 miles offshore on a rock the size of a house, safe, protected by the ocean itself. Infected can't swim, can't navigate, can't cross 3 miles of cold Atlantic water. I was completely, utterly alone. Day 1 of my isolation, April 16th, I took stock of my situation. Supplies. I'd received a delivery 2 weeks ago, so I had about 45 days worth of food. Rice, beans, canned goods, freeze-dried meals. Not luxurious, but sufficient. Water wasn't a problem. The rainwater collection system gave me plenty, and I had the desalination unit as backup. Power solar panels were functioning. Backup diesel generator had fuel for maybe 6 months of intermittent use. The lighthouse light itself was LED now, very efficient. I could keep it running indefinitely. Communication radio worked, but nobody was answering. I sent out calls on emergency frequencies, got nothing back except occasional desperate survivors who couldn't help me and I couldn't help them. Escape, no boat. The Coast Guard had removed it during the last supply run for maintenance and hadn't brought it back yet. I was stranded. 3 miles of ocean between me and the mainland. Might as well have been 3,000 miles. I made a decision that first day I would maintain the lights, even if no ships were coming, even if nobody needed it anymore. I would keep the light burning because that's what lighthouse keepers do. We keep the light, always. It gave me purpose, a reason to wake up, a job to do, something to focus on besides the fact that I might be alone on this rock forever. Day 2, I established a routine, the same routine I'd always followed, because routine was safety. Routine was sanity. 600, wake up, check weather conditions, record observations. 630, breakfast simple, efficient. 0700, equipment check, test generators, check solar panels, inspect pumps. 800, lighthouse maintenance, clean, repair, maintain. 1200, lunch. 1300, to continue maintenance work or personal projects. 1800, dinner. 1900, climb to light chamber, inspect Fresnel lens, clean glass, check rotation mechanism. 2100, personal time, reading, radio monitoring, telescope observation. 2300, sleep. Every day, the same schedule, because, without routine, without structure, isolation would destroy me. By day 5, I'd realized something terrible. I could see everything but do nothing from the light chamber. 150 feet above the ocean, I had a perfect view of the mainland. I watched through the telescope as the apocalypse unfolded. Saw people fleeing, saw infected hunting them, saw buildings burning, saw desperate survivors on rooftops signaling for help that wasn't coming, and I couldn't do anything, couldn't help, couldn't rescue anyone, could only watch from 3 miles away as people died. I saw a family trapped on a dock, watched them for 2 days as they ran out of options, surrounded by infected, watched them make their final stand, watched them fall. I saw survivors in a high-rise building, using mirrors to signal SOS, watched them for a week as their signals became more desperate. Then one day, no more signals, just an empty window. I saw boats trying to escape, some making it to open ocean, others being overwhelmed in the harbor. Saw people jumping into the water, swimming for their lives, being pulled down by infected who'd followed them in. Every day I watched people die, and I was safe, protected by 3 miles of water, completely useless. The guilt was crushing. I was alive, comfortable, safe, with food and water and shelter, while everyone else fought and died. Survivor's guilt became my constant companion. Day 10 brought the first major storm. I'd lived through dozens of storms in my 6 years as keeper. Atlantic storms are brutal, massive waves, hurricane force winds. Hurricane force winds, rain so heavy you can't see 10 feet, but they were familiar. Part of lighthouse life. You prepare, you secure everything, you ride it out. This storm was different because I was completely alone. No Coast Guard to check on me afterward, no emergency services if something went wrong, if the lighthouse failed, if I got injured, if the structure was damaged, there was nobody coming to help. The storm hit around 1400 hours. I'd been tracking it on the weather radio, watching the sky darken, feeling the barometric pressure drop. I secured everything that could move, closed all the storm shutters, made sure the backup generator was ready. The wind hit first. Gusts that made the entire lighthouse shake, and this was a structure built from thousands of tons of granite specifically to withstand Atlantic storms. I could feel it swaying, just slightly, but enough to notice. Enough to be terrifying. Then the waves, massive swells that crashed over the island, submerging the rocks completely. Water slammed against the lighthouse base with impacts that sounded like explosions. Spray reached halfway up the tower 75 feet above normal sea level. I climbed to the light chamber to check the beacon. Stupid, probably. Dangerous, definitely. But the light had to keep burning. That was the rule. The most important rule. The light never goes dark. The wind at the top of the tower was insane. Even inside the light chamber, protected by thick glass, I could hear it screaming. The whole structure was vibrating. The Fresnel lens kept rotating, kept sending its beam out into the storm, even though nobody was out there to see it. I looked toward the mainland through the telescope. Could barely see anything through the rain and spray, but I caught glimpses. The storm was hitting the coast hard, buildings collapsing, flooding. The infected didn't care about storms. I could see them still moving through the streets, still hunting, indifferent to the hurricane battering them. The storm lasted 18 hours, 18 hours of wind and waves, and the certainty that at any moment, the lighthouse might fail, might collapse, might be overwhelmed by the ocean. But it held. It had held for over 100 years. It held for one more storm. When it finally passed, when I could open the shutters and assess the damage, I found the island had been completely rearranged. Rocks moved. Equipment I'd thought was secured was gone swept into the ocean. The solar panels were damaged but functional. The antenna for the radio was bent but still working. And I was alone, still alive, still isolated. The storm had changed nothing, except to prove how vulnerable I really was. Day 15, I started talking to myself. Not just thinking out loud, actually having conversations. I'd ask myself questions and answer them in different voices. Would argue with myself about trivial decisions. Would narrate my actions like I was giving a tour to invisible visitors. Now the keeper checks the generator oil level. See how he opens the access panel. Very good technique. Been doing this for years. I knew it was a bad sign. Knew it meant the isolation was affecting me. But I couldn't stop. The silence was too much. The sound of my own voice, even talking to nobody, was better than the constant wind and waves. I started naming things. The generator became George. The main water pump was Betty. The Freno lens was the lady. I'd greet them every morning. Morning, George. How are we running today? Good, good. And Betty, still pumping strong. Excellent. And the lady, still beautiful as ever. Let's get you cleaned up. Day 20, I made my first attempt at fishing. My food supplies would last maybe another 25 days. After that, I'd need to find other sources. The ocean was full of fish. I just needed to catch them. I rigged a line using materials from the Lighthouse rope wire, a bent piece of metal for a hook, used barnacles scraped from the rocks as bait, cast it from the lowest accessible point on the island during low tide. Caught nothing the first day, or the second, or the third. On day 24, I finally caught a fish. Small, maybe 8 inches long, but it was food, protein. I cleaned it with a knife from the kitchen, cooked it on the electric stove. It tasted like the ocean, salty, strong, fishy, but it was fresh food. The first fresh thing I'd eaten in weeks. I started fishing every day, became better at it, learned which spots were most productive, learned what the fish responded to. Some days I'd catch 2 or 3, other days nothing. But it extended my food supply indefinitely. As long as I could catch fish, I could survive. Day 30 brought seabirds. Gulls had always been around the lighthouse. It was their territory as much as mine, but I'd never thought of them as food before. Now, with my supplies running low, I looked at them differently. They were meat. They were calories. They were survival. I made a trap using netting from old fishing equipment stored in the lighthouse basement, baited it with fish scraps, waited, caught my first gull on day 32. Killing it was harder than I expected. It struggled, made horrible sounds, but I needed food. I broke its neck quickly, tried to make it fast. Cleaning it was educational in a grim way. More meat than I'd expected. Dark meat, gamey, strong tasting, but edible, nutritious. I felt terrible about it. These birds had been my companions, my only connection to living things besides fish. And now I was eating them. But survival requires pragmatism. Sentiment is a luxury. I was alone on a rock with finite resources. I had to use what was available. By day 40, I had a sustainable food system. Fish when I could catch them. Seabirds when fishing was poor. Rainwater and desalinated seawater for drinking. My stored supplies as backup for when fresh food wasn't available. I could survive indefinitely. Physically, mentally was another question. The isolation was eroding me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd lived on this lighthouse for 6 years before the outbreak. Had spent weeks at a time alone between supply deliveries. Thought I understood solitude, but this was different. Before, I'd always known help was coming. The Coast Guard would arrive in a few weeks. I had a radio to call if there was an emergency. I had an endpoint to the isolation. Now, there was no endpoint. Nobody was coming, ever. The isolation was permanent, infinite, and that knowledge changed everything. I started having conversations with people who weren't there. My wife we'd divorced 5 years ago, but I'd talk to her like she was in the room. My father who'd died a decade ago, friends from my past. I'd set an extra place at meals, would ask their opinions on things, would wait for answers that never came. I knew they weren't real, knew I was hallucinating or fantasizing or having some kind of psychological break, but I couldn't stop. The need for human interaction was too strong. Even imaginary interaction was better than none. Day 50. I saw my first boat since the outbreak. I was in the light chamber doing routine maintenance when I saw it through the telescope. A sailboat, maybe 40 feet long, moving south along the coast about 2 miles offshore. I grabbed the signal mirror, flashed SOS, over and over. The international distress signal. Help, I'm here, come get me. The boat didn't change course, didn't acknowledge, just kept sailing south. I watched it through the telescope, saw people on deck. They were alive. They were sailing past, they were ignoring me. Maybe they didn't see the signals. Maybe they saw but were too scared to approach an unknown location. Maybe they thought the lighthouse was abandoned. Maybe they had their own problems and couldn't help a stranger. It didn't matter. They sailed past, disappeared over the horizon, and I was alone again. That was the moment I realized rescue might never come. That I might spend the rest of my life on this rock. That this lighthouse might be my prison until I died of old age or accident or simply gave up. The despair was overwhelming. I spent the next 3 days barely functional, didn't eat, barely drank, just sat in the light chamber staring at the horizon, hoping for boats that didn't come. On day 53, I decided to kill myself. I had it all planned out. I'd climb to the gallery at the top of the lighthouse, the narrow walkway that circles the light chamber, 150 feet above the rocks. I'd step off, it would be quick. 3 seconds of falling, then done. No more isolation, no more loneliness, no more watching people die from 3 miles away while being unable to help. I climbed the stairs, all 142 of them, opened the door to the gallery, stepped out into the wind, looked down at the rocks 150 feet below, looked out at the ocean, looked back at the mainland where the dead city waited, and I thought about the light. If I died, the light would eventually fail. Maybe not right away, it was automated, could run for months on solar power, but eventually, something would break, a mechanism would fail, a storm would damage something, and there'd be nobody to fix it. The light would go dark. For the first time in over 100 years, Graves' light would go dark. And if when ships started sailing again, when civilization started to rebuild, when people started navigating these waters again, the light wouldn't be there to guide them. They'd wreck on the rocks, die because the keeper had abandoned his duty. I stepped back inside, closed the door, climbed back down the stairs. The light had saved my life. Not because I wanted to live, but because I couldn't abandon the light. It was the only thing that mattered anymore, the only purpose, the only reason to keep breathing. Day 60 brought the infected to my island. I woke up to sounds I didn't recognize, scratching, bumping against the lighthouse base. I looked out the window. 3 infected were on the rocks. They'd arrived on daybreak, looked like they'd been floating on a piece of a dock that had broken free from the mainland. The current had carried them 3 miles across open ocean and deposited them on my island. My sanctuary was compromised. The infected couldn't get into the lighthouse. The door was heavy steel, designed to withstand storms, and they didn't have the coordination to open it. But they were here, on my island, walking around the base of the tower, looking up at the windows, making those horrible sounds. I watched them from the second-level window. They were in bad shape, waterlogged, damaged from their time in the ocean, moving slowly, but they were infected. They were dangerous, and they were between me and any access to the rocks. I couldn't fish with them there, couldn't check my rainwater collection barrels, couldn't do any exterior maintenance. I was trapped inside my own lighthouse. For 3 days they stayed, walking endless circles around the tower, never leaving, never giving up, just persistent, mindless hunting. On day 63, a storm came through, big waves. The infected were swept off the rocks, pulled back into the ocean, gone, but the knowledge remained. They could reach me. The ocean wasn't perfect protection. The island could be invaded. I started keeping watch more carefully, started checking the rocks every morning, started sleeping with a weapon, a heavy wrench from the maintenance toolkit. My sanctuary had become a prison with permeable walls. Day 70, I started making recordings. I found old cassette tapes in storage. The lighthouse used to have a tape recorder for logging weather observations before everything went digital. I rigged it to work with the solar power system and started recording myself, not for anyone else. There was nobody to listen but for me, so I could hear a human voice, so I could have conversations, even if both sides were recorded by me at different times. I'd record questions. How are you feeling today, Thomas? Then, an hour later, I'd play it back and answer out loud. Not great. The isolation is getting harder, but I'm managing. I'd record stories from my past, memories, experiences, things I'd done, places I'd been, people I'd known. Then I'd play them back days later, listening to myself talk about a world that didn't exist anymore. It helped, marginally. It gave me a sense of dialogue, of human interaction, even though I knew both voices were mine. But it also showed me how much my voice was changing, how my speech patterns were deteriorating, how I was starting to slur words, to forget common phrases, to struggle with language in ways I hadn't before. The human brain needs language, needs conversation, needs interaction. Without it, the language centers start to atrophy. I was losing my ability to communicate even as I desperately tried to maintain it. Day 80 brought a discovery that changed my perspective on the light. I was up in the light chamber doing maintenance on the Fresnel lens when I noticed something strange. The lens had marks on its scratches, smudges, imperfections I'd never noticed before, and when I looked closer, I realized they weren't random. They were deliberate. Letters, words. Previous keepers had scratched messages into the lens. Dozens of them, some dating back decades. JM 1957, still here. Still keeping the light. RT 1973, the loneliest job in the world. MK 1989, if you're reading this, you understand. SB 2003, we keep the light. Always. I traced the letters with my finger. These men, and they'd all been men until me, had stood exactly where I was standing. Had felt the same isolation. Had struggled with the same loneliness. Had kept the light burning through storms and fog and endless days of solitude. They'd left these messages for whoever came after. For me, a chain of keepers reaching back over a century, all connected by the same duty. Keep the light. I found a tool. Added my own message. TB 2024, the world ended. I'm still here. The light still burns. It made me feel less alone. I was part of something bigger than myself. Part of a tradition, a responsibility that transcended the apocalypse. Day 90, another boat passed. This time it was closer, maybe a mile offshore. A fishing trawler moving north. I signaled frantically, flashed the lighthouse's main beam in a pattern. Used the signal mirror. Even tried the foghorn, though it was unlikely they'd interpret it as a distress signal. They saw me. I could see someone on deck pointing at the lighthouse. They knew I was here. They changed course. For a moment, I thought they were coming. Thought rescue had finally arrived. Then they turned away, headed back out to sea. Away from the island, away from me. I watched through the telescope as they left. Saw someone lower a pair of binoculars. Saw them shake their head. Saw the boat accelerate away. They'd seen the lighthouse, seen my signals, and decided not to stop. Maybe they thought it was a trap. Maybe they didn't want to risk approaching an unknown location. Maybe they had limited supplies and couldn't take on another person. Maybe they were just scared. It didn't matter. They left, and I understood that even if boats started passing regularly, there was no guarantee any would stop. I was visible but unreachable. Present but abandoned. Alive but forgotten. The psychological impact was devastating. I spent the next week in a deep depression. Stopped maintaining my routine. Stopped caring about the light. Just sat in my quarters, staring at the wall. On day 97, the light went out. I'd neglected the maintenance. A bearing in the rotation mechanism had seized. The lens stopped turning. The beam went dark for the first time since the outbreak started. And something inside me broke, seeing it dark. The one thing that mattered. The one purpose. The one reason to keep going. And I'd let it fail. I forced myself up the stairs. Forced myself to diagnose the problem. Forced myself to fix it. Took me 6 hours of work. But I got the bearing freed. Got the lens rotating again. Got the light burning. When it came back on, when I saw that beam cutting through the darkness again, I cried. Sobbed like a child. Because the light was everything. Without it, I was nothing. Just a man alone on a rock waiting to die. The light gave me purpose, and I couldn't let it fail again. Day 100 was a milestone. 3 months alone. A quarter of a year of isolation. I marked it in my journal. I'd been keeping one since day one. Documenting everything. Knowing nobody would probably ever read it, but needing to record it anyway. The journal showed my deterioration clearly. Early entries were coherent, detailed, organized. Recent entries were scattered, confused, sometimes just fragments of thoughts. Day 100, still here, light burning, caught fish. Saw birds, alone, always alone. Why am I doing this? For what? For who? The light, always the light. Must keep the light. It's all that matters, all that's left. I read back through the early entries, could barely recognize the person who'd written them. That Thomas Brennan had been sane, functional, capable. This Thomas Brennan was fragmenting, losing coherence, becoming something else. Day 110, I started conducting experiments. I needed to know, could infected survive in ocean water? Could they cross distances by floating on debris? How long could they survive without food? I had a perfect laboratory. I could observe the mainland through the telescope. Could watch infected behavior from a safe distance. Could document patterns. I spent hours every day watching them through the telescope. Saw them congregating near water. Saw some wade into the ocean, disappear under the waves, never resurface. Saw others cling to floating debris. Saw them drift with currents. Most didn't survive. The ocean killed them drowning, hypothermia, being battered against rocks. But some did survive. Like the 3 that had reached my island. The odds were low, but not zero. I documented everything, drew diagrams, made notes, created a detailed study of infected behavior in maritime environments. Nobody would ever read it, but it gave me something to do. Gave my mind something to focus on besides the crushing loneliness. Day 120 brought the worst storm yet. I'd survived the day 10 storm. Thought I understood Atlantic storms. Was wrong. This was a hurricane. Not technically, it wasn't tropical season, but a massive nor'easter with hurricane force winds. The weather radio had stopped working weeks ago, so I had no warning beyond watching the barometric pressure drop and the sky turn the wrong color. The wind hit like a physical force. Gusts over 100 miles per hour. The lighthouse swayed noticeably several inches at the top, enough to make you seasick. Windows cracked from the pressure. Rain came horizontal, driven through tiny gaps in the stonework. The waves were worse. Massive swells that buried the entire island underwater. The lighthouse base was designed for this sloped granite to deflect water, but I could feel the impacts. Thousands of tons of water slamming the structure every few seconds. I was in the equipment room when the power failed. Solar panels ripped away. Main generator flooded despite being in a supposedly waterproof compartment. Backup generator wouldn't start, fuel line damage. The light went dark. I had to fix it. Storm be damned. The light couldn't go dark. I climbed to the light chamber in complete darkness, feeling my way up the stairs. Water was leaking in somewhere. The stairs were slick, treacherous. I nearly fell twice. Reached the light chamber. Found the manual override for the rotation mechanism. Found the emergency power supply, a battery backup I'd maintained carefully for exactly this situation. Connected the battery. The light came on. Weak, not as bright as normal, but on. The beam cut through the storm. I stood there in the light chamber, 150 feet above the ocean, the whole structure shaking, water spray coating the windows, and I kept the light burning, because that's what keepers do. The light never goes dark. Not in storm, not in fog, not during the apocalypse. The storm lasted 36 hours. When it finally passed, the island looked like a war zone. Both solar arrays destroyed. Main generator permanently damaged. Backup generator repairable but needed parts I didn't have. The battery backup had maybe 48 hours of power left. After that, the light would go dark unless I could find another power source. I spent day 122 and 123 in a frantic search through the lighthouse, looking for anything that could generate electricity. Found old lead-acid batteries in storage, probably hadn't been used in years, might not even hold a charge. Found a wind turbine kit that had never been installed. Found solar panel components that might work if I could assemble them correctly. I worked 20-hour days, barely slept, barely ate. Had to keep the light burning. It was the only thing that mattered. By day 125, I'd rigged something that worked. A hybrid system using the old batteries, partially functioning solar components I'd salvaged and repaired, and a makeshift wind turbine I'd built from parts and scrap. It was inefficient, fragile, held together with hope and desperation, but it kept the light burning. Day 130, I realized I was losing my mind. Not metaphorically, literally. My grip on reality was slipping. I had full conversations with people who weren't there, would argue with them, get angry, sometimes even physically fight the air where I imagined they stood. Would set places at meals for 5 or 6 imaginary companions and get upset if their food wasn't perfect. I heard voices constantly, whispering, talking, sometimes shouting. Couldn't tell if they were auditory hallucinations or just my imagination. Didn't matter. They were real to me. I saw things that couldn't be there. People on the rocks. Boats that vanished when I looked directly at them. Lights on the mainland that appeared and disappeared. Couldn't trust my own senses anymore. And the worst part, I knew I was losing my mind. Had enough awareness left to recognize the hallucinations, to understand I was breaking down, but not enough control to stop it. Isolation was eating my brain, consuming the parts that made me human, turning me into something else. Day 140, I made a decision. I would swim to the mainland, 3 miles, in cold Atlantic water. Probably suicide, but I couldn't stay on this island anymore. Couldn't endure another day of isolation. Would rather die trying to reach shore than continue this slow psychological death. I prepared carefully. Made a flotation device from empty plastic containers lashed together. Gathered supplies in a waterproof bag. Chose a calm day with minimal current. Stood on the rocks, ready to jump in. Looked back at the lighthouse, at the light chamber where the beam rotated faithfully. At the structure I'd maintained for 140 days alone. If I left, who would keep the light? Nobody. It would eventually fail, and then it would be dark forever. I couldn't do it, couldn't abandon the light, even to save my own sanity. The light mattered more than I did. I climbed back up into the lighthouse, put away the flotation device, returned to my routine. The light had saved my life again, or condemned me to continue living. I couldn't tell which anymore. Day 150 brought an realization that changed everything. The light was attracting them. I'd been watching the mainland through the telescope, documenting infected behavior as part of my desperate attempt to stay mentally occupied, and I noticed a pattern. At night, when the lighthouse beam swept across the shore, infected would move toward it. Not intelligently, they didn't have the coordination or cognitive ability for that, but instinctively, like moths to a flame, they'd congregate on the beaches closest to the lighthouse, drawn by the only light source in a dead city. I watched them pile up on the shore, hundreds of them, maybe thousands over the weeks, all staring out at the ocean, at my light, and some of them would wade into the water. Most would drown, get pulled under by currents or waves, but some would cling to debris, floating docks, pieces of boats, logs, anything that floated, and the current, combined with tides and wind, would sometimes carry that debris toward my island. I'd thought the 3 infected who'd reached my island on day 60 were a fluke, random chance, bad luck, but they weren't. They were inevitable. The light was drawing infected to the shore, and some percentage, small but not zero, were making it across the 3 miles of ocean to my island. I was creating my own threat. The very thing I was maintaining, the light, my purpose, my reason for survival, was endangering me. I had to make a choice, turn off the light and be safe, or keep it burning and accept the risk. It wasn't really a choice. I'd already decided on day 53 when I'd stepped back from the gallery railing. The light mattered more than my safety, more than my life. I kept the light burning, and I started preparing for more infected to reach the island. I fortified the lighthouse door with additional bars, created weapons from tools, heavy wrenches, sharpened metal poles, anything that could be used to defend myself. Set up a watch routine where I'd check the rocks every few hours. The light would keep burning, and I would defend it. That was my job. That was my purpose. That was all I had left. Day 160, another storm came through. Not as bad as the day 120 hurricane, but still brutal, and it brought visitors. When the storm cleared, I found 5 infected on the rocks. They'd arrived on what looked like a section of roof, probably torn off a building by the storm, and swept out to sea with them clinging to it. 5. More than I'd ever dealt with before, and they were between me and the island's only fishing spot. I watched them from the 2nd level window. They were in bad shape, battered by the storm, waterlogged, barely able to coordinate their movements, but they were infected. They were dangerous. I had to eliminate them. I couldn't fish with them there, couldn't access my rainwater collection barrels, couldn't maintain the exterior of the lighthouse. I planned it carefully, studied their movement patterns for 2 days. They walked in predictable circuits around the tower. No coordination, no strategy, just mindless wandering. I opened the lighthouse door during low tide when the rocks were most exposed. Stepped out with my weapon, a 4-foot metal pole sharpened to a point on one end, heavy enough to use as a club on the other. The nearest infected saw me immediately, started moving toward me. That horrible shambling gait, that sound they made, part moan, part growl, completely inhuman. I waited until it was close, then swung the club end, connected with its head. The impact was sickening, wet, crunching. It went down. The others were converging now. I had to move fast. I used the rock's uneven surface to my advantage. Stayed on high ground where my footing was better. Let them come to me where they'd have to climb, where they'd be off balance. Took down the 2nd one with another head blow. The 3rd one got close enough to grab my arm. I felt its cold, waterlogged skin, smelled the rot, shoved the pointed end of my weapon through its eye socket. It collapsed. The 4th and 5th were easier. They were slower, more damaged. I dispatched them efficiently, clinical, like I'd done this 100 times instead of just now. When it was over, 5 bodies lay on the rocks. I was covered in their fluid, stark, thick blood, or whatever their circulatory system contained now. Breathing hard, shaking from adrenaline, but alive, and the island was clear again. I dragged the bodies to the edge of the rocks during high tide and let the ocean take them, watched them disappear into the depths. Then I went back inside, sealed the door, and scrubbed myself clean with precious fresh water. That night, I kept the light burning, because that's what I did. The light never goes dark. Day 170, I found myself talking to the lighthouse, not the equipment, not George the generator or Betty the pump. The lighthouse itself, the structure, the stones. We've been through a lot together, haven't we? I'd say, running my hand along the granite walls. You've kept me safe, protected me from storms and infected, and my own desperation. You're the only friend I have left. I'd tell it about my day, about the fish I'd caught, about the birds I'd seen, about the infected I'd killed, about how lonely I was, and sometimes I swear this is true, though I know it's impossible. The lighthouse would answer, not with words, but with sounds, creaks and groans as the stone adjusted to temperature changes, vibrations as waves hit the foundation, whistles as wind moved through gaps. I'd interpret these sounds as responses, as communication, as proof that I wasn't completely alone. I knew it was insane, knew I was anthropomorphizing an inanimate structure, knew my brain was creating meaning from random noise because it was so desperate for interaction. But I couldn't stop. The lighthouse had become more than shelter. It had become my companion, my partner, my only connection to anything besides the ocean and the infected and the endless, crushing solitude. Day 180, I saw the rescue ship. Not a small boat like the others, a real ship, Coast Guard cutter, moving along the coastline about 5 miles out, doing a methodical search pattern. They were looking for survivors. I activated every signal I had, flashed the lighthouse beam and SOS, lit signal flares I'd been saving, used the signal mirror, even wrote help on a white sheet and hung it from the gallery railing. And they saw me. I could see them change course through the telescope, saw them heading toward the island. Rescue, finally, after 180 days alone. But as they got closer, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not joy. Fear. Fear of leaving the lighthouse. Fear of rejoining humanity. Fear of losing the only thing that had given my life meaning for the past 6 months. The light needed me. Who would maintain it if I left? Who would keep it burning? The ship anchored offshore couldn't approach too close because of the rocks. Deployed a small boat, but people in Coast Guard uniforms rowing toward my island. I watched them approach. My heart was racing. Part of me wanted to run down to meet them. Part of me wanted to hide in the lighthouse and pretend I wasn't here. They landed on the rocks. One of them called out, "Is anyone here? This is the United States Coast Guard. If you can hear us, please respond." I should have answered immediately. Should have run down to meet them. Should have shown gratitude for rescue. Instead, I climbed to the light chamber, checked the rotation mechanism, cleaned the lens, performed my routine maintenance, because that's what I did. Every day at this time, the routine couldn't be broken. They found me in the light chamber for Coast Guard personnel staring at the filthy, emaciated man obsessively cleaning a Fresnel lens while they called his name, Thomas Brennan. One of them asked, "Are you Thomas Brennan, the lighthouse keeper?" "The light," I said. My voice was rough. I hadn't spoken to anyone real in 180 days. "The light needs to be maintained. The rotation mechanism needs greasing every day. The lens needs cleaning. The power system needs monitoring. If I leave, who will do it?" They looked at each other, concerned glances. The kind of looks people give when they realize someone's mental state is questionable. "Mr. Brennan, the lighthouse is automated. It doesn't need a keeper. And even if it did, we have people who can take over. You need medical attention. You need food. You need to come with us." "No." I backed away from them. Toward the lens, protective. "I can't leave. I'm the keeper. This is my responsibility. The light never goes dark. That's the rule. The most important rule." One of them tried to approach. I grabbed my weapon, the sharpened pole I'd used to kill infected. "Stay back. I have to keep the light. I have to stay." They didn't force me, didn't try to subdue me, just talked, calmly, rationally, told me about the survivor settlements, about the reconstruction efforts, about how the Coast Guard was re-establishing navigation aids but needed healthy personnel, not keepers who'd been isolated for 6 months. Told me about the psychological trauma of isolation, about how I needed help, about how the lighthouse would be fine without me. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of patient conversation before I finally agreed to leave. And only because they promised me something. They promised the light would keep burning, that someone would maintain it, that my duty would be honored. I made them swear. I made each of them individually promise that the light would never go dark. Then I gathered my few possessions, my journal, my cassette recordings, the tools I'd used. A piece of the Fresnel lens that had broken off during a storm. I couldn't leave without taking part of the light with me. I took one last walk around the lighthouse, touched the walls, said goodbye to George and Betty and the lady, thanked the structure for keeping me alive, added one final message to the Fresnel lens, TB 2024, day 180. I kept the light. I survived. I'm leaving now. But part of me will always be here. Then I climbed down the 142 stairs for the last time, walked across the rocks, got into the small boat. As we rowed away, I watched the lighthouse recede, watched the light continue its eternal rotation, watched my prison and my sanctuary and my purpose disappear into the distance. I'd survived 180 days alone on a rock in the Atlantic Ocean. I'd maintained the light through storms and infected and psychological breakdown. I'd done my duty as a keeper, but I'd lost something essential in the process. Some part of me was still on that island, still climbing the stairs, still cleaning the lens, still keeping the light. And I knew I'd never get that part back. The Coast Guard took me to a survivor settlement on the mainland, a fortified compound built around what used to be a National Guard base outside Boston. Maybe 5,000 survivors living behind walls, growing food, trying to rebuild some semblance of civilization. They put me in medical quarantine first. Standard procedure, checked me for bites, for infections, for diseases, found malnutrition, dehydration, vitamin deficiencies, and what the doctor called severe psychological trauma consistent with prolonged isolation. My weight was down to 142 pounds from my normal 180. My hair had gone almost completely gray. I was only 38 but looked 60. My hands shook constantly. My eyes had trouble focusing after 6 months of only looking at distant objects. My skin was damaged from sun and salt exposure, but physically, I'd survived relatively well. The psychological damage was worse. I couldn't sleep in the quarantine room. It was enclosed, windowless, quiet, wrong. I needed to hear the ocean, needed to feel the lighthouse swaying in the wind, needed the routine of checking the light. I'd wake up in panic at 1900 hours the time I always climbed to the light chamber, would insist I had to check the lens, would become agitated when they told me I was miles from the lighthouse. They sedated me multiple times. For my own safety, they said, to help me rest, but the sedation brought nightmares. I'd dreamed the light had gone dark, that I'd failed in my duty, that ships were wrecking on the rocks because I wasn't there to maintain the beam. I'd wake up screaming about the light, about my responsibility, about having to get back to the island. The psychiatric evaluation on day 185 was extensive. They wanted to understand what had happened to me, wanted to document the effects of prolonged isolation for their record. I told them everything, about the routine I'd maintained, about talking to the lighthouse, about the hallucinations, about the infected I'd killed, about the boats that had passed without stopping, about standing on the gallery preparing to jump, about choosing the light over my own survival again and again. The psychiatrist listened, took notes, then gave me a diagnosis: severe PTSD with dissociative features, complicated by prolonged isolation syndrome, auditory and visual hallucinations, and what we're calling duty fixation, an obsessive compulsion centered around your role as lighthouse keeper. She said I'd need months of therapy, maybe years, that the isolation had fundamentally changed my brain chemistry, my thought patterns, my sense of self, that I might never fully recover. But you survived, she said. That's remarkable. Most people would have broken completely. You maintained enough functionality to keep yourself alive for 180 days. That shows incredible resilience. I didn't feel resilient. I felt broken, damaged, like a piece of equipment that had been stressed beyond its design limits and would never work properly again. They transferred me to the main settlement on day 190, gave me a small apartment in a converted barracks building. Other survivors lived in the same building. We shared common spaces, had regular social contact, were part of a community. I lasted 4 days before I had a complete breakdown. Too many people, too much noise, too much stimulation. After 6 months of silence and solitude, the constant human presence was overwhelming. I couldn't process it, couldn't handle conversations, couldn't tolerate crowds, couldn't function in social situations. I'd have panic attacks in the dining hall surrounded by people, would flee back to my apartment and barricade the door, would spend hours rocking back and forth, hands over my ears, trying to block out the sounds of human activity. And at 1900 hours every day, I'd become agitated, would pace my apartment, would insist I had to check the light, would sometimes try to leave the settlement, heading toward the coast, trying to get back to the lighthouse before they'd stop me. They moved me to the mental health facility, the same one where other severely traumatized survivors lived. The people who couldn't reintegrate, who'd been broken by what they'd experienced. There was a woman who'd watched her children die and couldn't speak anymore. A man who'd been trapped in a collapsed building for 3 months and had claustrophobia so severe he couldn't be indoors. A teenager who'd survived alone in a basement for 8 months and had forgotten how to interact with people. And me, the lighthouse keeper who couldn't leave the lighthouse even though he'd left it weeks ago. We were the ones who'd survived but couldn't live, who'd made it through the apocalypse but lost ourselves in the process. The therapy was intensive. Daily sessions. They tried to help me separate my identity from my role as keeper, tried to help me understand that my value as a person wasn't dependent on maintaining the light, tried to help me process the trauma of isolation, but it didn't work. Couldn't work. Because they didn't understand. The light wasn't just my job. It was my purpose. My meaning. The only thing that had kept me from jumping off the gallery on day 53. The only reason I'd survived when every day was crushing loneliness and psychological torture. Without the light, I was nothing. Just a broken man with no reason to exist. Day 200 was when everything changed. A Coast Guard officer came to the mental health facility. Asked to speak with me specifically. They brought me to a private room. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "I have news about Graves' light." My heart rate spiked. "What's wrong? Is the light still burning? Did someone maintain it? Did they keep it working?" "The light is fine," he assured me quickly. "We have personnel maintaining it, but we have a problem. The automated systems keep failing. The makeshift power system you built is too complex. Nobody else understands it well enough to maintain it properly. We've had 3 power failures in the last week." "I told you," I said, agitation rising. "I told you the system was fragile. It needs constant monitoring, daily maintenance. You can't just automate it and forget about it." "That's why I'm here," he said. "We need someone who knows the lighthouse, someone who can maintain it properly. We need a keeper." He paused. "Let that sink in. We're asking if you'd be willing to return. Not permanently, we'd rotate you out every few weeks for mandatory rest and psychological support. But we need someone who understands that lighthouse. And frankly, you need to go back. Your therapists think that controlled exposure to the lighthouse might help you process the trauma. That avoiding it entirely is preventing your recovery. Return to the lighthouse. Go back to the island. Resume my duty." Every therapist I'd spoken to would say it was a terrible idea. That it would reinforce my obsessive fixation. That it would prevent healing. But they didn't understand. Healing meant letting go of the light. And I couldn't let go. The light was all I had. All I was. "Yes," I said immediately. "I'll go back." They set conditions. I could only stay for 2 weeks at a time. Then mandatory return to the mainland for psychological evaluation and social interaction. I'd have a radio with scheduled check-ins. I'd have emergency evacuation procedures if my mental state deteriorated. I agreed to everything. I'd have agreed to anything. I was going back to the lighthouse. They transported me back to the island on day 203. The Coast Guard boat dropped me off on the rocks. I climbed the familiar path to the lighthouse door, opened it, stepped inside. Everything was different. They'd repaired the storm damage, replaced the solar panels, fixed the generator, updated some of the equipment. It was cleaner, more organized, more functional than when I'd left, but it was still the lighthouse. Still my lighthouse. Still home. I climbed the 142 stairs to the light chamber. The Fresnel lens rotated smoothly. The beam cut through the darkness exactly as it should. Perfect, beautiful. I touched the lens, found my scratched messages still there. Found the messages from other keepers, a century of duty carved into glass. Added a new message, TB 2024, day 203. I came back. The light still burns. It will always burn. Then I began my routine. The routine I'd maintained for 180 days. The routine that had kept me alive and sane, or as sane as I could be. 600, wake up, check weather, record observations. 630 breakfast. 700 equipment check. 800 lighthouse maintenance. The same routine, the same purpose, the same meaning. I was home. I've been rotating on and off the island for the past 6 months now. 2 weeks on the lighthouse. 1 week on the mainland. Back and forth. It's the only way I can function. When I'm on the mainland, I'm barely alive, going through the motions, attending therapy sessions I don't believe in, talking to people I don't connect with, counting the days until I can return to the island. When I'm on the lighthouse, I'm whole, complete, purposeful. I maintain the light. I keep the routine. I fulfill my duty. And for those 2 weeks, everything makes sense. The therapists say I'm not healing, that I'm trapped in a cycle, that I'm avoiding processing my trauma by retreating to the source of it. But they're wrong. The lighthouse isn't the source of my trauma. It's the cure. It's the only place where my broken mind can find peace. I know I'm not normal anymore. No, I'll never be the person I was before the outbreak. Know that most people would look at my life-splitting time between an isolated lighthouse and a mental health facility and see tragedy. But I see purpose. I see duty. I see meaning in a world that lost all meaning when the infected came. Some survivors rebuild cities. Some farm. Some fight to reclaim territory from the infected. Some try to restart civilization. I keep the light. It's what I do. It's all I do. It's all I ever do. And maybe that makes me broken. Maybe that means I didn't really survive the isolation. That part of me is still trapped in those 180 days alone. But the light burns. Every night, guiding ships that are slowly starting to sail again, warning them away from the rocks. Serving its purpose the same way it has for over 100 years. I'm part of that now. part of the chain of keepers stretching back through time. Men who chose isolation and duty over comfort in society. Men who understood that some jobs are more important than personal happiness. The light never goes dark. That's the rule. The most important rule. And as long as I'm alive, as long as I'm capable, I'll make sure that rule is honored. I want to tell you what I learned spending 180 days alone on a lighthouse island. The truths about isolation that nobody talks about because they're too dark, too uncomfortable. First, humans aren't meant to be alone. We're social creatures at our core. Isolation doesn't make you stronger, it breaks you. It damages your brain in ways that can't be fully repaired. Every day alone is a day of invisible injury accumulating until you don't recognize yourself anymore. Second, purpose can save you and destroy you simultaneously. The light kept me alive when I wanted to die, but it also made me unable to live normally. I traded my life for my purpose. Some would say that's noble. I say it's just another form of death, slower, but equally final. Third, you can adapt to anything, but adaptation isn't free. I adapted to isolation, learned to function alone, developed coping mechanisms and routines that kept me alive. But those adaptations made me unsuited for normal life. I'm optimized for solitude now, broken for society. Fourth, the worst part of trauma isn't the event itself, it's realizing you'll carry it forever. I'm 6 months removed from day 180. I'm safe, I'm fed, I'm not in danger, but I'm still on that island in my mind. Still climbing the stairs to check the light, still talking to granite walls because they're the only thing that responds. The trauma is permanent, carved into my brain like names carved into glass. Fifth, sometimes survival isn't winning. Sometimes it's just losing more slowly. I survived, I'm alive, but I'm not sure I'm living. I exist in this liminal space between the person I was and the person I became. Not quite dead, not quite alive, just maintaining. Just keeping the light burning because that's all I know how to do. The psychiatrist asked me once, if you could go back to day one, knowing everything that would happen, would you make the same choice? Would you still stay on the island? I said yes, without hesitation, because the alternative was trying to escape to the mainland, getting infected, dying in the chaos, and then the light would have gone dark. For the first time in over 100 years, Graves' light would have failed in its duty. I couldn't let that happen, couldn't let the chain of keepers end with me through cowardice or fear. So yes, I'd make the same choice. I'd stay on the island. I'd endure the isolation. I'd sacrifice my sanity for the light. Does that make me noble or insane? I genuinely don't know anymore. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe duty and madness are the same thing when you're alone long enough. It's day 203 now. I'm back on the island for another 2-week rotation. The lighthouse is quiet except for the wind and waves. The light rotates in the chamber above me. Everything is as it should be. Tomorrow at 0600, I'll wake up, check the weather, record observations. At 0630, I'll eat breakfast. At 0700, I'll check the equipment. At 1900, I'll climb to the light chamber and inspect the Fresnel lens. The same routine I've followed for hundreds of days. The same routine I'll follow until I die or become too broken to function, whichever comes first. Some of the other keepers in the mental health facility ask me why I keep going back. Why I don't try to move on, to heal, to build a new life in the settlements. I tell them about the messages carved in the lens, about the chain of keepers, about the duty that transcends personal comfort. But the truth is simpler. I go back because I don't know how to be anywhere else. The lighthouse is the only place that makes sense, the only place where my broken brain can find peace. I'm not healing, I'm not recovering, I'm not getting better. I'm just maintaining, like the lighthouse itself, not improving, not degrading, just existing in a state of careful preservation, and maybe that's enough. Maybe maintenance is all we can hope for after trauma like this. Maybe some of us don't get to heal, we just get to not get worse. The light burns, I keep it burning. That's my purpose. And if that's all my life is now, maintaining a light on a rock in the ocean, rotating between isolation and a mental health facility, existing but not living, then so be it. I survived 200 days of the zombie apocalypse. 180 of those days alone on a lighthouse island, watching the world end from 3 miles away, maintaining a light that nobody was coming to see. I kept the light burning, through storms and infected and psychological breakdown, through loneliness that crushed my mind and isolation that broke my spirit. I did my duty, and I'll keep doing it, for as long as I can, for as long as the light needs a keeper, because that's what I am now. Not Thomas Brennan, not a person with hopes and dreams and a future, just a keeper, a function, a role. The light never goes dark, that's the rule. And I'll honor that rule until there's nothing left of me but habit and routine and the muscle memory of climbing 142 stairs. Stay connected, stay together, and remember isolation is a slow poison. It kills parts of you that you don't know are dying until they're already gone. I learned that lesson. I'm living that lesson every day, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. AIF, this story made you understand something about isolation, about duty, about the price we pay for purpose. Hit subscribe. This story was based on real lighthouse keeper experiences, real isolation psychology, real Atlantic Ocean conditions, and the actual Graveslight Station off Massachusetts. Drop a comment. Could you survive 200 days alone on a lighthouse island? Would you maintain the light even after rescue came? What's the longest you've been truly alone? I read every comment. Your experiences with isolation, they matter. If you made it through the full 3 hours, you understand endurance, you understand commitment, you understand what it means to see something through to the end even when it's painful. Next story drops next week. Hit the bell so you don't miss it. Stay connected, stay social, and remember humans aren't meant to be alone. Isolation damages us in ways we don't recognize until we're already broken. The light burns, always has, always will. But the keepers who maintain it pay a price most people will never understand. Thanks for listening. Thanks for witnessing what 200 days of isolation actually means. It means more than you know.